As a captain in the Army Medical Corps, I could save countless lives. Yet I couldn't save my own mother. On the day of her funeral, my stepfather threw me onto the street and roared, "That uniform can't save you now." What he didn't know was that my mother, a silent genius, had left me $1 million secret. One that would strip him of every ounce of his false dignity. In the military, they train you for everything. They teach you how to navigate by the stars, how to handle a weapon in the dark, how to stay calm when everything around you is chaos. But no one ever teaches you how to face the silence in your own childhood home. Hello, I'm Captain Anya Sharma. Thank you for being here with me today. If you're listening, I'd appreciate it if you'd like this story and maybe let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It helps to know I'm not just speaking into the void. My story begins the day I came home from a deployment, not to a parade, but to a funeral. My mother's. She'd become one of the cold, hard statistics of the COVID-19 pandemic, passing away suddenly and utterly alone in a hospital bed. Her death left just two people to pick up the pieces, me and my stepfather, Frank. We were essentially two strangers, bound together only by a shared, devastating loss. At least, that's what I believed back then. My heart was too crowded with grief to see the truth that was hiding in plain sight. My mother's house, a modest single-story home nestled in the suburbs of North Carolina, wasn't grand. But every inch of it was a chapter of my life. There was the bay window in the living room where I'd curl up with a book for hours, sunlight warming the pages. There was the kitchen, a room that always seemed to hold the faint, sweet scent of her apple pie, even when the oven was cold. And then there was her garden, a small, perfect patch of earth where she and I had planted rose bushes together years ago. Returning after so much time away, I spent most of my days out there. I'd walk the small stone path, my fingers brushing against the soft petals of the roses, breathing in the smell of damp earth and blooming flowers. I was trying to find her in the things she'd loved, trying to feel her presence in the quiet rustle of the leaves. That house was everything I had left of her. It was my only anchor, the one solid point connecting my disciplined, sterile life as a soldier to a past that felt warm and real. I had this dream that one day, when my service was over, I would come back to that house, to that garden, and I would live out the rest of her life for her. But Frank, it turned out, had other plans. He put on a masterful performance of a man shattered by grief. He'd spend hours slumped in my mother's favorite armchair, a glass of whiskey sweating in his hand, staring at a wall as if he could see her ghost there. He told me stories, endless stories about how much she missed me, how she'd show all the neighbors photos from my last deployment, her voice brimming with pride. One evening, as I sat on the porch swing, watching the fireflies begin to dot the twilight, he came and sat beside me. He took my hand. His was heavy and warm. "Anya," he started, his voice thick and cracking. "It's just us now. You'll be deploying again soon, and I don't know what I'll do here all alone." And then he began to cry, not loudly, but with these silent, gut-wrenching sobs. The tears of a grown man looked so fragile, so out of place. And sitting there in my rigid uniform, a wave of guilt washed over me. It was a dull, aching feeling that settled deep in my chest. I hadn't been there when she got sick. I hadn't been there to hold her hand. Maybe taking care of Frank was the last thing I could do for her. I gave his shoulder a gentle, comforting pat. It was a simple gesture, an act of solace I would come to regret for the rest of my life. A few weeks later, just before I was scheduled to return to my unit, Frank made his move. He laid it all out so reasonably. "This house," he said, waving a hand around the living room. "It's just too big for one person. It's filled with too many painful memories." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "What if we sell it? We could get a smaller, more manageable place. You can go serve your country with peace of mind, knowing that everything back home is taken care of. I'll handle all the assets, the money, all of it. You're a soldier, Anya. You shouldn't be distracted by things like this." It sounded so logical. I was about to be sent to a place where communication would be sporadic at best. Having a father figure to manage things seemed like a weight off my shoulders. He proposed setting up a joint bank account where the proceeds from the sale would go. He'd use it to cover expenses and keep the rest safe for my future. And me, an officer trained in situational analysis and threat assessment, I just nodded. Blinded by a cocktail of grief, guilt, and a desperate need to believe in something, I agreed. Packing up that house was like methodically packing away my own past. Each box I sealed felt like a final goodbye. I found my old middle school swimming medals, a small collection of faded blue ribbons. I found a stack of letters my mom had written to me when I was at the academy, her familiar, looping handwriting filling every page. At one point, I just sat on the floor in her closet, clutching one of her old cable-knit sweaters, burying my face in the wool to breathe in the faint, lingering scent of her perfume. And I just cried. Frank was there, helping. He was almost too eager, bustling around with packing tape and boxes. He kept saying things like, "All this old stuff won't really fit in a modern apartment." He gently convinced me to donate or sell most of the furniture, to get rid of almost everything except for a few boxes of truly essential keepsakes. In the end, my entire childhood, my mother's legacy, was reduced to a few cardboard boxes, which he said he was taking to a storage unit he'd already rented. The day I left to rejoin my unit, Frank drove me to the airport. He was unnervingly cheerful, talking nonstop about the future, about how proud I'd be when I came back and saw how perfectly he'd set everything up for us. I stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar streets of my hometown blur and fade away. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. It was that prickling on the back of your neck, the one a soldier gets right before things go wrong. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the sorrow of leaving home again. Frank mentioned the money from the house sale would be deposited into the joint account soon. I never asked for the account number. I never asked to see a single piece of paper. I acted like a child, not an officer. It was a fatal mistake. A few months later, I was injured during a training exercise. Nothing life-threatening, but it was serious enough to get me sent stateside for recovery. I couldn't return to my unit right away. I called Frank, and he told me he'd moved into a new condo. When the taxi dropped me off, it was at a luxury but sterile high-rise building that felt cold and impersonal. The room he showed me to was the guest room. It was small, with no large windows, just a narrow slit that looked out onto a brick wall. He said my boxes were still in storage. When I asked about our finances, about the money from the house, he just smiled a thin, placating smile. "You just rest and get better," he said. "Dad's got everything under control." That night, lying in that strange, dark room, I could hear him moving around in the living room, the distinct clink of ice in a glass. And in that moment, I knew. I had lost control. I was no longer the keeper of my mother's legacy. I was just a guest, living in a life that had been paid for with my own inheritance. My recovery time was supposed to be a few weeks. It stretched into a month, then another. I was a prisoner in Frank's polished high-rise cage. And with my movements limited, my other senses, the ones honed by years of training, took over. I started to notice things, small details that didn't add up. The first was the smell. A heavy, sour scent of bourbon that clung to the air every evening when he came home. It was a smell that tried to hide under the scent of expensive cologne, but it was always there, a sickly sweet undertone to our quiet dinners. Then came the phone calls. He'd take them in his bedroom, the door shut, but I could hear the muffled cadence of his voice, low whispers that would suddenly escalate into sharp, angry hisses before falling silent again. He started staying out late, often not returning until the sky was beginning to gray, his movements clumsy and loud in the pre-dawn quiet. Whenever I'd bring up the hospital bills or the need for money, he'd wave his hand dismissively. The smile would still be there, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. "Don't you worry about a thing, Anya. The money is safe. It's for your future." His words were the same soothing script, but his gaze would flicker away, refusing to meet mine. My military discipline taught me to observe, to document, to see patterns. And the pattern I was seeing made my skin crawl. It felt like I was living on a minefield, each step taken with a silent prayer that I wouldn't trigger a blast. One morning, a bill arrived from the hospital. The number was significant, I needed access to the joint account. This charade had to end. I waited until the afternoon, when he seemed his most sober, and approached him in the living room. "Frank," I said, keeping my voice level and calm, "I need the account information to pay this bill." He was watching a game show on TV, the sound of mindless applause filling the room. He didn't even turn to look at me. "How much?" he asked, his tone clipped. I told him the amount. I heard him snort, a short, ugly sound of derision. "Always money with you," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. Then he heaved himself out of the chair, disappeared into his bedroom, and came back a moment later. He threw a thick wad of cash onto the coffee table. The bills scattered slightly. "Here, take it." The gesture, the tone, the cold indifference, it stunned me into silence. This wasn't a father caring for his daughter. This was a creditor paying off a nuisance. It was a transaction meant to demean, to put me in my place. The pride I carried, the dignity of my uniform and my rank, felt like it had been slapped across my face. I picked up the money, and it felt dirty in my hands. The real breaking point came on a Friday night. Frank stumbled in well after midnight, reeking of alcohol, his eyes glazed over. I knew it was a risk, but I couldn't live on the minefield any longer. I stood up and blocked his path to the bedroom. "Frank, we need to talk. I want to see the bank statements. Now!" He stopped, swaying slightly. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, bloodshot and furious, locked onto mine. He didn't say a word. He just took one unsteady step forward and shoved me. Hard. The heel of his hand connected directly with my injured shoulder. A bolt of white-hot pain shot through me, so intense my vision swam. I cried out, stumbling backward, my back hitting the wall with a dull thud. He staggered back, a grotesque smirk twisting his lips. "Just slipped," he slurred, his voice a mocking imitation of concern. "Soldier like you, thought you'd be tougher than that." He turned and shuffled away down the hall, leaving me there, clutching my throbbing shoulder, the agony in my body nothing compared to the ice-cold shock in my soul. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had been ripped off, and for the first time, I saw the monster underneath. After that night, a new kind of silence fell over the apartment. It was heavy and sharp and dangerous. Frank acted as if nothing had happened, moving around with a forced, casual air that was more terrifying than his anger. I was silent too, because I was afraid. It was an emotion so foreign to me, so contrary to my entire being, that I barely recognized it. I was trained to face the enemy on the battlefield, to run toward the sound of gunfire. I was not prepared for an enemy who slept down the hall. I was afraid of his volatility, of the unpredictable rage of an alcoholic. I retreated to my room, my small, windowless cell. I spent my days performing my physical therapy exercises with a robotic, detached precision. The methodical stretching, the painful strengthening, it became a ritual. A silent act of defiance. When I tried to contact my unit for an update, I found he had changed the Wi-Fi password. The Ethernet cable was gone from the wall jack. I was completely cut off. A captain in the United States Army, held prisoner by her own stepfather. One afternoon, my mother's best friend, Martha, called to check in. "Anya, honey, is everything all right? I haven't heard from you in ages." Her voice was so warm, so familiar, so full of my mother's world that tears instantly sprang to my eyes. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Frank's shadow fall across my doorway. He was listening. "I'm okay, Martha," I lied, my voice sounding thin and strange to my own ears. "I'm recovering well." Another lie. "Frank is taking wonderful care of me." Each word was a betrayal, a small knife twisting in my gut. I made an excuse and ended the call as quickly as I could. After I hung up, I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. The woman staring back was a stranger. Her eyes, once clear and determined, were now wide with fear. My uniform taught me about honor, but my life had become a cage of deceit. Frank grew bolder. One night, I simply asked him where he'd been. The question was quiet, but it was enough. His face contorted with rage. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep like a vice. That's none of your damn business, he hissed, his face so close to mine I could smell the stale liquor on his breath. He squeezed, his knuckles white, holding on until I winced in pain. The next morning, the proof was there, printed on my skin in shades of purple and blue. The distinct, ugly marks of his 5 fingers. A perfect handprint. I stared at it in the bathroom mirror, not with shame, but with a cold, clarifying anger. This wasn't just a bruise. This was evidence. This was a declaration of war. I could be injured. I could be trapped. But I would not be defeated. That mark on my arm wasn't a sign of my weakness. It was a reminder that I was in a fight. And a soldier never, ever gives up a fight. The random acts of aggression soon evolved into a systematic campaign of control. It started with a key. One afternoon, Frank asked for my copy of the apartment key. When I hesitated, he put on his mask of fatherly concern. "You're still recovering, Anya. You shouldn't be going out alone," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Anything you need, you just tell me. Dad will get it for you." My refusal was met with a cold stare that extinguished his fake smile instantly. "It's my house," he stated, the words flat and hard. There was no room for argument. I handed it over. And so began a new, terrifying ritual. Every time he left, I would hear the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, a final metallic click that echoed louder than any gunshot I'd ever heard. I, a captain who had commanded a platoon, was now locked in a 2-bedroom apartment. My only view of the world was a pane of glass overlooking a busy street. I'd watch people walk their dogs, carry groceries, live their lives, and a feeling of profound helplessness would wash over me. This physical confinement was a unique kind of hell. A psychological warfare more insidious than any danger I had faced on the battlefield. I still had one weapon, I thought: my cell phone. One day, while Frank was in the shower, I found a signal strong enough by the window and tried to call my commanding officer. I just needed to hear a familiar voice, to report my status. But Frank must have been listening, always listening. The bathroom door flew open and he stormed into my room, his face purple with rage. "Who are you snitching to?" he roared, snatching the phone from my hand. I reacted on instinct, grabbing for it. "Give it back, that's military property." My defiance was a lit match on gasoline. His hand flew, and a searing, white-hot sting exploded across my cheek. The force of it snapped my head to the side. The air crackled with a sudden, ringing silence. "In this house," he snarled, his face inches from mine, his teeth clenched. "I am the commanding officer." The physical pain was nothing. It was the humiliation that took my breath away. It wasn't just a man striking a woman. It was a calculated assault on my identity, a desecration of my rank and everything I had worked my entire life to become. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. This war, I knew then, would not end quietly. Mealtimes became a form of torture. We no longer ate together. Most nights, he'd come home drunk, throwing a greasy bag of fast food on the kitchen counter for himself, before retreating to the living room. On the rare occasions he did cook, he'd leave a plate for me on the stovetop, set aside like scraps for a pet. The silence in the apartment grew heavier, thicker, until it felt hard to breathe. I started losing weight. My body, deprived of proper nutrition and worn down by stress, was healing at a crawl. The strength I had always taken for granted was seeping away, and I could see the satisfaction in his eyes when he looked at me. He was enjoying this. He wanted to break me, to grind the soldier out of me until nothing was left but a weak, dependent thing he could control. My world shrank to the 4 walls of my room. One day, desperate for something to hold on to, I was rummaging through the duffel bag I'd packed from my mother's house. Tucked at the bottom was a small carved wooden box. Inside were the few treasures I had saved: her old reading glasses, a worn-out copy of the Bible, and a small, outdated USB flash drive. With no computer, the drive was useless. So I held on to the Bible. It was the one she'd kept on her nightstand, its pages soft and thin from years of use. Tucked inside were notes she had written, prayers for my safety on every deployment. Her faith had been so simple, so strong. Mine was being tested to its absolute limit. Clinging to that book in my silent prison, I didn't pray for rescue. I prayed for understanding. I tried to reconcile the idea of a loving God with the evil that was living down the hall. I was trying to find a strength that went beyond military discipline, to find the same anchor in those pages that had held my mother steady her entire life. The violence became more frequent and more casual. A deliberate shove as I walked down the hall. A foot stuck out to trip me. One time, he pushed me during an argument in the bathroom. I lost my balance on the slick tile and my head hit the wall hard. It left a large dark bruise high on my forehead. For the next week, I had to wear my hair down, the bangs carefully arranged to hide it. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. A captain in the United States Army, covering up wounds inflicted by her own guardian. The physical pain was a familiar enemy. But the shame of having to hide it, of having to pretend I was okay, that was the poison that was truly eroding my soul. It was a direct attack on a soldier's pride. I spent hours at my window, my prison porthole. I'd watch the life I was supposed to be a part of scroll by below. Sometimes I would see them, other soldiers, walking down the street in their uniforms. A Marine in his dress blues. A couple of Army guys in their ACUs, laughing as they headed into a coffee shop. And every time I saw them, an unbearable burning ache would rise in my chest. I missed my team. I missed the purpose, the order, the feeling of belonging to something bigger than myself. Locked away up here, I was nothing. A non-entity, a prisoner. But every time I saw that uniform, a tiny ember of defiance would glow a little brighter inside me. I made a promise to myself and to the memory of my mother that I would not let him extinguish it. Watching those soldiers, I felt so disconnected from the person I was supposed to be. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation, stripped of your own authority, until you almost forgot who you were? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes just speaking our truth is the first step toward reclaiming ourselves. It became clear that Frank's drinking was just a symptom of a much deeper disease. He was a heavy gambler. His rages were no longer random. They were predictable storms that followed hushed, frantic phone calls, where I'd hear words like deadline and payment. One night, the storm broke with a terrifying force. He came home smelling of cheap whiskey and desperation, his eyes wild. Something was different this time. This wasn't just anger, it was a rabid frenzy. He started with a lamp, sweeping it off a table with a roar. It shattered against the wall. I scrambled to my feet. "Frank, stop, just stop." He turned to me, his face a mask of pure fury, veins standing out on his neck. He didn't come for me. Instead, he drew back his foot and kicked the wooden coffee table between us. The table flew through the air and slammed into my shins, the impact sending a sickening shockwave up my legs. I cried out and collapsed to the floor. As I struggled to push myself up, gasping, he was on me. He drew his foot back again and drove it, hard, into my ribs. The air exploded from my lungs. Every bit of self-defense training I'd ever received was useless against the surprise of the attack and the weakness of my own recovering body. In that moment, staring up at him as he loomed over me, breathing in ragged gasps, I understood. He was no longer just trying to control me. He genuinely wanted to hurt me. As a soldier injured in the line of duty, I received monthly disability benefits from the Army. It was the only money I had that he hadn't been able to touch. But eventually, he found that too. He cornered me in the kitchen, his posture aggressive. "I need money to run this house, to take care of you," he growled, the lie so thin it was transparent. He demanded my debit card. I refused. That money was more than just currency. It was a lifeline from the world I belonged to. It was a matter of honor. The confrontation was short and brutal. He didn't hit me this time. He just grabbed my wrist, his grip like iron, and leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "Who the hell do you think you are? You're a freeloader living in my home. Now give me the card, or I swear to God, you won't eat another meal in this house." He had found my last vulnerability. He was weaponizing my own survival. With the card in his hand, a new terrifying calm settled over him. He leaned down, his foul breath washing over my face, and whispered the words that froze the blood in my veins. "You should be grateful I even let you stay here. Would have been better for everyone if you just caught a stray bullet on your last tour, wouldn't it?" The words hit me harder than any physical blow. He didn't just resent me. He didn't just want my money. He wished I was dead. He looked at my service, my sacrifice for our country, and saw it as an inconvenience. That night, the pain in my ribs was a raging fire. My old shoulder injury flared up in sympathy. I had no money for the stronger painkillers I needed. I just lay there in the dark, curled in a ball of agony. And the true, horrifying reality of my situation finally sank in. He didn't just want me gone. He wanted me erased. I had to get out. A few nights later, after he'd drunk himself into a stupor on the living room couch, I made my move. Using a bobby pin from my bag, I knelt in the dark by the front door, my hands shaking. It was a skill they teach you in survival training, something you never think you'll use in a luxury condo. My heart hammered against my ribs. I worked the pin in the lock, my breathing slow and measured, just like they taught me. I felt the last tumbler shift. The lock gave a tiny, almost inaudible click. Success! Freedom was inches away. But the click, as quiet as it was, had been enough. Like a beast startled from its den, Frank was suddenly awake and roaring. "Where do you think you're going?" he bellowed. He launched himself off the couch and was on me before I could even straighten up. He gave me no chance to speak, to explain. He yanked me backward from the door with such force that I fell hard onto the polished floor. His eyes fell on the bobby pin still clutched in my hand. A slow, ugly, triumphant smile spread across his face. "Playing the hero, are we?" he sneered. I tried to scramble away, but he grabbed me, his fingers tangling in my hair. In the struggle, as I twisted to get free, his hand lashed out. His fingernails, sharp and ragged, raked down my cheek. A line of fire erupted on my face. I felt the skin tear, followed by the immediate warm trickle of blood. The stinging pain made me see stars. He dragged me back to my room, threw me inside, and I heard the key turn in the lock from the outside. "Stay in there and think about what you did." His voice came, muffled, through the door. I lay on the floor, my hand pressed to my bleeding face. I had failed. And this failure had left a mark. The next morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The bleeding had stopped, but a raw, angry red line ran from my cheekbone almost to my jaw. It was ugly and stark against my pale skin. My first thought was one of failure. It was the mark of my failed escape, the brand of a prisoner. But then, I looked closer. In the military, scars are records. They are evidence of battles fought, of survival. A piece of shrapnel here, a surgical scar there, they told a story, and this was a battle scar. It was the first mark from a war that was entirely my own. Unlike the bruises on my arms and ribs, I couldn't hide this. It was on my face for the world, and for me, to see every single day. And as I stared at my own reflection, something inside me shifted. The fear was still there, but now it had a partner, a cold, hard resolve. That scar was not my shame. It was my oath. Frank started bringing new things home. First, it was a massive flat-screen television that took up an entire wall. Then, a sleek, expensive sound system. He claimed he'd made a few successful investments, a story so flimsy it was insulting. I knew he was lying. I just didn't know the full, soul-crushing truth yet. I found it one afternoon in the pocket of a coat he'd thrown on the floor. A crumpled handful of receipts from a downtown pawnshop. My heart seized in my chest as my eyes scanned the cheap, printed paper. The descriptions were clinical, precise, and each one was a separate, twisting knife. Father's military medals. Mother's stamp collection. West Point graduation watch. He had found the storage unit. He had taken a key and unlocked my past, only to sell it piece by piece for his gambling debts. The most sacred relics of my family, the symbols of my father's valor and my mother's quiet passions, had been traded for a few more hours at a poker table. The final blow, the one that shattered everything, was the last piece of paper in the stack. It was a copy of a bank statement for the so-called joint account. I unfolded it with trembling fingers, my eyes searching for the balance, still clinging to a sliver of hope that something, anything, was left. The number at the bottom of the page was stark and brutal. $17.42. He had taken it all, every last dollar. My mother's entire legacy, the money she had worked her whole life for, the safety net she had painstakingly built for my future. It was gone. Burned through. I just stood there in the silent apartment, the papers shaking in my hand. It wasn't anger I felt. It was a terrifying, hollow emptiness. The floor had just dropped out from under my world. Every last bit of trust, every final foolish hope I had harbored, it all vanished in that moment, leaving nothing behind. I had nothing left to lose. That evening, I didn't hide in my room. I waited for him in the living room, the pawn slips, and the bank statement laid out on the coffee table like evidence at a crime scene. When he walked in, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "Where is the money, Frank?" I asked. My voice was as cold and dead as the feeling in my chest. His eyes flickered from my face to the papers on the table, and all the color drained from his skin. He started to stammer, to build a wall of denials, but I gave him no ground. "You sold my father's metals," I said, my voice hardening, each word a sharp, unforgiving stone. "You took everything." My decision to call him you, not Frank, not Dad, was the final trigger. It was the drop of water that made the dam of his sanity burst. The mask of civility he barely wore dissolved, replaced by a primal, unrestrained rage. He came at me like an animal. Even though I was expecting it, I was too weak, too broken to truly defend myself. This wasn't a shove or a grab. This was a beating. He punched and he kicked, his blows aimed with a vicious intelligence at my already injured shoulder, my bruised ribs. I went down hard on the floor, trying to curl into a ball, my arms covering my head. But he didn't stop. He kicked me again and again, in the side, in the back. I heard and felt a sickening crack from my rib cage. I didn't scream. I bit down on the inside of my cheek and tasted blood, refusing to give him the satisfaction. Through the haze of pain, I saw his face. It was twisted, ugly, distorted with a hatred so pure it was almost inhuman. He wasn't just trying to hurt me anymore. He was trying to break me into pieces that could never be put back together. When his rage was finally spent, leaving him panting, he wasn't finished. He grabbed a handful of my hair and dragged me, scraping and stumbling, to the front door. He wrenched it open. A wall of wind and torrential rain roared into the hallway. "Get out!" he screamed, his voice raw. "That uniform can't save you now." He gave me one last, violent shove. I tumbled out of the doorway, landing in a heap on the cold, wet floor of the building's hallway. I was wearing nothing but a thin t-shirt and pajama bottoms. He stood over me for a moment, a dark silhouette against the light of the apartment. "You have nothing," he spat down at me. "You're just a homeless person." Then he slammed the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was the final punctuation mark on my old life. I had just been thrown out of the home that was bought and paid for by my mother's love. I lay there on the cold linoleum, unable to move. Rain lashed through an open window at the end of the hall, soaking the thin fabric of my clothes. My entire body was a symphony of pain. Every breath was a sharp, stabbing agony in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move. Using the wall for support, I slowly, painfully, dragged myself to my feet. I had nothing. No phone, no wallet, no ID. Just the flimsy clothes on my back, a body battered and broken, and a heart that had been completely shattered. I stumbled out of the building and into the driving rain. The cold water washed over my face, mixing with the tears. I didn't even realize I was crying. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I had to move. A captain in the United States Army, homeless in the very country I had sworn to protect. I don't know how long I walked in the rain. An hour? A lifetime? The city was a blur of smeared neon lights and slick, black asphalt. Eventually, the pain in my ribs became a roaring fire, and my legs gave out. I collapsed in the meager shelter of a bus stop, my body finally surrendering. That's where a cruising police car found me. Two officers, their faces etched with concern under the flickering blue and red lights, saw the state I was in, soaked to the bone, bruised and shivering uncontrollably. They took me to the emergency room. They asked me what happened, their questions gentle but firm. I looked at their crisp uniforms, at the badges that represented the very order and law I had sworn to uphold, and I lied. I was mugged, I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. How could I explain the truth? How could I say that a captain in the United States Army had been beaten and thrown into the street by her own stepfather? The shame was a heavier weight than any of my injuries. After the doctors patched me up, diagnosing me with 2 fractured ribs and severe contusions, a kind-faced social worker came and took me to a women's shelter. The shelter was another world. It was crowded and loud, humming with a constant low-grade misery. I was assigned a cot in a large dormitory, one of 20 identical beds lined up in neat, depressing rows. I didn't speak to anyone. I just sat on the edge of the thin mattress, my arms wrapped around my throbbing torso, and I observed. I'd slept in worse conditions. I'd been in barracks with peeling paint and leaky roofs in the middle of a war zone. But those places had been filled with purpose. They had been filled with camaraderie, with the shared understanding that we were all in it together. Here, there was only a shared, silent desperation. With every pained breath my broken ribs allowed, the real wound deepened. It wasn't the physical pain, it was the utter loss of my own identity. In this place, I wasn't Captain Sharma. I wasn't a leader, a soldier, an officer. I was just another broken woman in a sea of broken women, another nameless face with no past and no future. The nightmares came back with a vengeance. I'd dream of Frank's twisted face, his voice hissing insult as the blows rained down. But then the dreams would shift, melting and reforming until I was back in the desert, the smell of sand and cordite filling the air. The 2 traumas, the enemy abroad and the enemy at home, bled into one another, creating a chaotic hellscape in my mind. I'd jerk awake, my heart pounding, drenched in a cold sweat with no idea where I was or who I was fighting. The abuse had pried open the lid on my combat trauma, a box I thought I had sealed shut long ago. I felt like I was losing my grip. My greatest enemy was no longer Frank. It was my own mind. In the long sleepless nights on that lumpy cot, I began to question everything I'd ever built my life upon. Not God, but my mission. The very purpose of my existence. Why did I join the army? Why did I endure the hardship, the deployments, the sacrifices? To protect a nation that included men like Frank? To give everything I had, only to be thrown away like a broken tool when I was no longer useful? The words that had been my creed, loyalty, honor, sacrifice, now felt like a cruel joke. They were hollow, meaningless. The fire that had always burned inside me, the one that powered me through West Point, through officer training, through the worst days of combat. It felt like it had finally been extinguished. My days bled into one another in a gray, numb haze. Until one night, an older woman from the cot next to mine saw me trembling, my teeth chattering in the aftermath of another nightmare. She got up, her movements slow and careful, and gently placed a worn, thin blanket over me. "It's okay, girl," she whispered, her voice raspy but kind. "You're safe here." That simple phrase, that small selfless act of kindness, somehow pierced through the thick wall of my despair. It was a gesture of solidarity. It reminded me of the brotherhood I had lost, of the unspoken code among soldiers to look out for one another. It was a reminder that even in the darkest, most hopeless of places, humanity could still exist. And for the first time in weeks, I cried. Not tears of pain or hopelessness, but quiet tears of gratitude for a single, tiny spark of light. When my ribs had healed enough to allow for more than a painful shuffle, I started spending my days at the public library. It was quiet, it was orderly, and it had computers. I sat in front of a monitor and tried to log into my military email account. It took dozens of tries. I had to go through password recovery, answering security questions that felt like they belonged to another person's life. Finally, I was in. My inbox was flooded. There were dozens of emails from my commanding officer, from my platoon sergeant, from my entire team. "Captain, where are you? Report in." "Sharma, we're all worried sick. Are you okay? Ma'am, please let us know you're safe. They were looking for me. They were worried. I hadn't been forgotten. I wasn't ready to reply, not yet. But just knowing that I was still a part of something, a part of a family that had not abandoned me, it was like a transfusion of strength. I started to read. I researched legal aid for veterans. I looked up state laws on domestic violence and financial abuse. I started to form a plan. The fire wasn't out. It was just smoldering, waiting for the right moment to burn again. In the library, reading those emails, I realized that sometimes all we need is a reminder that we belong somewhere. Have you ever felt lost, and a small connection to your past or your community helped you find your way again? Share your story in the comments. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to build a new life from the wreckage. It wasn't a life I recognized, but it had a rhythm. I found a part-time job serving coffee at a small cafe near the public library. The pay was barely enough to get by, but I was saving every dollar I could. I was still sleeping on a cot at the shelter, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a fragile sense of forward motion. One afternoon, I was at a soup kitchen run by a local veterans organization. It was a place I'd started going not just for the food, but for the quiet, unspoken understanding in the room. Then he walked in. A man in a tailored dark suit and polished leather shoes. He looked as out of place as a hawk in a chicken coop. He scanned the room, his eyes moving past the worn faces of the other vets, clearly looking for someone specific. And then his gaze landed on me. Instantly, every nerve ending in my body went on high alert. My posture straightened. My hand, resting on the table, curled into a tight fist. My training took over, my mind cataloging exits, potential weapons, the distance between us. I was ready for a fight. He approached my table cautiously. "Excuse me, are you Captain Anya Sharma?" he asked, his voice polite and even. The fact that he knew my rank was a blaring alarm bell. I didn't answer him. I simply pushed my chair back and stood up, creating a safe distance, my body angled in a defensive stance. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice flat and cold. "Who sent you?" The man seemed to understand my reaction. He took a small step back and held his hands up in a placating gesture. "Please, don't be alarmed, Captain," he said. "My name is David Davis. I'm an attorney. I'm here to help you." The word help was a trigger. In the world I was now living in, no one gave you anything for free. Help was just a word people used before they took something from you. Mr. Davis gestured patiently to an empty chair at the table. I remained standing, watching his every move. He slowly reached into his suit jacket, produced a business card, and placed it on the table between us. "I am the executor of your mother's estate, Ms. Elena Sharma." Hearing my mother's name was like a physical blow. The wall of ice I had built around my heart trembled. "My mother?" I whispered, the words barely audible. "My mother didn't have an estate. She didn't have a will." Mr. Davis nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, Captain, she did. A very detailed one. Our firm was retained by her several years ago. She gave us specific instructions. We were only to seek you out under very particular circumstances." He looked me directly in the eye then, and his gaze was steady and clear. "Anya, your mother knew. She knew what kind of man Frank really was." I stared at him, my mind racing, analyzing every micro-expression on his face, every intonation in his voice. The soldier in me, the one who had been trained to spot an ambush, was screaming that this was a trap. Another one of Frank's sick games. But the daughter in me, the part that was so desperate and alone, wanted so badly to believe him. "Why should I trust you?" I challenged, my voice hard. He let out a long, slow breath. "Because your mother left something for you. A proof. Something she said only you would know." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "She told me, ask my daughter about Project Starlight and about her father's old telescope." The world stopped. The clatter of trays, the low murmur of conversations in the soup kitchen, it all faded away to a dull roar. Project Starlight. It was a silly secret name my mom and I had given to the nights we'd spend in the backyard when I was a kid, looking at the constellations through my dad's old telescope. No one else in the world knew that name. No one. The dam broke. Tears I didn't know I had left to cry streamed down my face, hot against the faint line of the scar on my cheek. My legs gave out and I sank into the chair, my body shaking with a relief so profound it felt like pain. He was telling the truth. "Okay," I said, my voice hoarse and broken. "What do you want?" "I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee, somewhere quieter," Mr. Davis said gently. "And then I'll explain everything." For the first time in months, I lowered my weapons. I followed him out of the soup kitchen and to a polished black sedan parked at the curb. As we drove away, I looked back at the worn-down building, at the place that had been my sanctuary. It felt like I was being evacuated from a battlefield, with no idea if I was heading toward peace or just to another, different kind of war. In a quiet corner of a cafe, Mr. Davis didn't waste any time. "Anya, your mother was not just a homemaker. That was a life she chose, but it wasn't the whole story." He slid a file across the table. "For over 30 years, your mother was a genius software developer. She worked as a private contractor for major tech firms under an assumed name, selling her patents. She was brilliant, and she accumulated a significant fortune." I listened, stunned into silence. My mother? The woman who loved gardening and baking pies? The woman whose greatest joy was reading a novel in her favorite armchair? "And," Mr. Davis continued, his voice soft but firm, "she knew Frank was a gambler with a cruel streak. She was afraid he would hurt you after she was gone. So she created a fortress, a legal and financial fortress, in the form of a very special will, with clauses specifically designed to protect you and to bring him to justice. A secret. My whole life, my mother had been living with this enormous secret, and that secret, I was beginning to understand, was my salvation." The air in the small coffee shop was warm, filled with the comforting scent of roasted beans and steamed milk. It felt like a different universe from the soup kitchen I had just left. I took a steadying breath, trying to anchor myself to reality before asking the question that felt too absurd to even speak aloud. "A massive fortune. How much are we talking about?" Mr. Davis took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. He set the cup down with a quiet click. "Anya," he said, his voice calm and measured, "after all assets were liquidated and secured in a trust, the total net value of the estate your mother left for you is valued at approximately $59 million. The words didn't register. They were just sounds, abstract and nonsensical, like a sentence in a foreign language. 59 million. Me. The woman who, just yesterday, had counted out a handful of crumpled dollar bills to see if she could afford a new pair of socks. The soldier who had lived her entire adult life on a government salary. The heir to a fortune? It was ludicrous. I shook my head, a small involuntary gesture of denial. "No, that's impossible. There has to be a mistake." But Mr. Davis just looked at me, his gaze unwavering. "There is no mistake, Captain. It's all legally documented, audited, and secured. And you are the sole beneficiary." My mind was a chaotic storm of disbelief. "Then why?" I struggled to form the question. "Why now? Why didn't you find me sooner?" "Because of the will's primary clause," he explained, leaning forward slightly. "Your mother was a brilliant strategist. She stipulated in no uncertain terms that the trust was to remain sealed and you were not to be contacted as long as you were cohabitating with or had any financial entanglement with Frank. She knew him. She anticipated his greed. He let that sink in. She also retained a private investigation firm with funds from a separate account to discreetly monitor your situation. Their only instruction was to report if that specific condition, your connection to Frank, had been severed. When they reported that you had been physically removed from the premises and were in a state of distress, the clause was triggered. It was her way of making absolutely certain that he could never touch a single cent of it. And that's when I finally broke. The knowledge of her foresight, the sheer intricate brilliance of her love, It was too much to bear. I buried my face in my hands, and the deep, ragged sobs I had suppressed for months finally tore their way out of me. I wasn't crying for the money. I was crying for my mother, for the magnificent secret life she had lived, for the immense sacrifice she had made. She had hidden her genius behind the quiet facade of a suburban wife, endured a life with a man like Frank, all to build a fortress around me. All those years, I had been so focused on my own career, my own mission, convinced that I was the strong one, the protector. I never once saw the heavy armor she was wearing every single day. The pain that bloomed in my chest was sharper than any fractured rib. It was the agony of regret, mingled with a love so profound it was breathtaking. Mr. Davis sat in silence, giving me the space and dignity to grieve. When my sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, he spoke softly. "Your mother was so incredibly proud of you, Anya. Everything she did was to ensure you would have a future." I lifted my head, wiping the tears from my face with the back of my hand. And in that moment, the chaotic pieces of my life clicked into place. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a random miracle. This was a plan. My mother's final, brilliant, strategic plan. The prayers I had whispered into the darkness of my room had been answered, not by a divine thunderclap, but by the quiet, enduring power of a mother's love. My faith, which had been so brutally shaken, returned not as a question, but as a certainty. A faith in the unbreakable bond that still protected me. My mother had given me one last mission. "What do I do now?" I asked Mr. Davis. The question was quiet, but the tremble was gone from my voice. It was the voice of an officer asking for a briefing. "The first step," he said, "is to get you out of your current circumstances. We've already secured a corporate apartment for you. It's safe, it's private. After that, we begin the legal process of the asset transfer." He began to talk about financial advisors, about portfolios and investments, but my mind was already on the battlefield. "Mr. Davis," I interrupted, "I want to sue him. I want to press charges. I want Frank to answer for every single thing he did." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "I was hoping you would say that," he said. "Don't worry, Captain. We have the best litigation team in the state." That night, I stood in the bathroom of a clean, beautiful, anonymous apartment. It was safe. It was mine. I looked at myself in the mirror. The bruise on my forehead was gone. The dark circles under my eyes had begun to fade, but the scar on my cheek was still there, a thin silver line. When I looked at it now, I didn't see failure. I didn't see a victim. I saw a reminder. The woman in the mirror was no longer a casualty. She was a soldier with a new objective. My mother's legacy wasn't the $59 million in a trust fund. That was just the ammunition. Her true legacy, the greatest gift she had left me, was the strength to fight for justice. And my war was just beginning. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions and meetings that felt less like legal proceedings and more like the strategy sessions before a major combat operation. My legal team, led by a sharp, no-nonsense litigator named Ms. Miller, became my new platoon. We gathered our arsenal of evidence, the detailed medical records from my hospital stay, the initial police report I had filed, and the years of surveillance reports from the private investigators my mother had hired. Each piece of paper was another round of ammunition. Reliving the story over and over was grueling. Each retelling was a forced march back through the trauma. But I learned to approach it with the detached precision of a soldier giving an after-action report. I was no longer a lone victim recounting her pain. I was a commander briefing her troops. I had an army of lawyers and paralegals at my back. Recounting the events was no longer an act of re-traumatization, it was an act of strategy. Every word I spoke, every detail I provided, was a bullet aimed directly at Frank. When Frank was finally served with the lawsuit and the criminal complaints, his reaction was predictably pathetic. He tried to contact me, leaving a series of voicemails on a number my legal team had set up to monitor him. They were a pathetic mix of manipulative pleading and impotent threats. One message would be a tearful ramble about how much he loved my mother, how everything he did was to try and take care of me. The next would be a snarling tirade, calling me an ungrateful liar. Listening to the recordings, I felt nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. Mr. Davis's team had also completed their deep dive into his past. It was a sordid history of massive gambling debts, small-time scams, and a string of broken relationships. The monster hadn't been created overnight. He had always been there, lurking behind a thin veneer of charm. My mother and I just hadn't been trained to see him. On the day of the trial, I made a decision. I didn't wear a victim's somber dress. I wore my uniform. My full Army service uniform, the formal dress blues, with every medal and ribbon I'd ever earned pinned perfectly to my chest. I wanted him, the jury, and the world to see exactly who he had tried to break. I was not a nameless, helpless woman. I was a captain in the United States Army. When I walked into the courtroom, a hush fell over the room. I didn't look at the spectators. My gaze swept forward and found him. Frank was sitting at the defendant's table, looking gaunt and sallow. When his eyes met mine, when he saw me standing there in the full dignity of my uniform, he flinched. He couldn't hold my gaze. He looked away, down at his hands, a broken man. And in that moment, I felt a strange, profound sense of peace settle over me. The fear was completely gone. In this room, under the protection of the law, he was powerless. The entire power dynamic had been inverted. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand with my back straight and my head held high. I didn't look at Frank. I looked at the 12 faces of the jury. Ms. Miller approached. "Captain Sharma," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Could you please tell the court how you received the scar on your cheek?" I took a deep breath, just as I would before giving a command. Then I began my report. My voice was steady, even, and devoid of emotion. I recounted the facts, just the facts, as if I were debriefing a patrol. I told them about the first shove against my injured shoulder, the handprint bruised onto my arm, the stinging humiliation of the slap, the final, brutal beating. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply presented the truth. I was not there for pity. I was there to reclaim my honor. Frank's lawyer did his best to paint me as an unstable soldier, suffering from severe PTSD, suggesting my injuries were self-inflicted or exaggerated. He tried to twist my service into a weakness. But Ms. Miller was a master tactician. She dismantled his narrative piece by piece. She presented the medical reports with doctors' notes detailing the extent of my injuries. She presented the testimony of the social worker and another woman from the shelter. She presented the bank statements, showing the systematic draining of my inheritance. Finally, she put Frank on the stand. Under her relentless, laser-focused cross-examination, he began to crumble. His lies became tangled, his answers evasive. Pushed into a corner, his facade finally cracked, and the monster I knew so well revealed himself. He started yelling, cursing at Ms. Miller, his face contorting into that familiar mask of rage. It was the last nail in his coffin. The jury wasn't out for long. When they filed back into the jury box, I stood, my shoulders squared. The foreman cleared his throat and looked at the judge. "On the charge of aggravated assault, we the jury find the defendant guilty." He continued down the list. Guilty of battery, guilty of grand larceny, guilty of elder abuse, guilty. A wave of profound relief washed over me, so immense it almost buckled my knees. Mission accomplished. I had fulfilled my mother's final command. As they cuffed Frank and led him away, he shot me a look of pure, venomous hatred. But it didn't matter anymore. His power over me was gone, forever. After the trial, my world was fundamentally altered. The legal gears turned, and my mother's immense, secret fortune was transferred to my name. For the first time in my life, I could have bought anything I wanted. A new car, a beautiful house, a life of leisure. I tried, for a week or two, to imagine that life. I walked through luxury apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows and browsed catalogs for things I never knew existed. But it all felt hollow, like trying to furnish an empty room in my soul. The money was a tool, not a destination. I had survived. I had found justice. But now I faced the most daunting question of all. What was I going to do with the rest of my life, and with this staggering legacy? The answer, when it came, was quiet but clear. I would not be returning to active duty. My war was over, but my service was not. My new battlefield was right here, at home. The idea came to me one afternoon at a VA support center, a place I had started visiting to feel a connection to the world I had left behind. I saw a young female Marine sitting alone in a corner, her gaze distant and lost, her shoulders slumped with a weight that had nothing to do with the pack on her back. And in her 1,000-yard stare, I saw a reflection of myself in the shelter. I saw the same disorientation, the same pain hiding behind a mask of toughness. It was a lightning bolt of understanding. I suddenly realized how many of us there were. Soldiers who came home from one war only to find themselves fighting another, in the silence of their own homes, in the confines of their own minds. They needed a safe harbor. They needed a commanding officer who understood their fight. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. My mother's legacy was never meant for just one person. I spent the next year liquidating assets and laying the groundwork. I used the great majority of my inheritance to establish a nonprofit foundation. The mission was clear: to provide secure housing, pro bono legal services, and trauma-informed therapy for female veterans and military spouses who were victims of domestic and financial abuse. I bought a sprawling, slightly neglected former school building in a quiet part of the state and poured resources into renovating it, transforming the institutional hallways into a place of warmth, dignity, and safety. I named it the Starlight Project. I was taking our small, secret memory and turning it into a beacon for others. On the day we officially opened, I stood at the front door in my service uniform, ready to welcome our first residents. One by one, they arrived. Strong, brave women who had served their country with honor, only to be brutalized by those they should have been able to trust. I didn't look at them with pity. I looked at them with the deep, unwavering respect of a fellow soldier. As I shook each woman's hand, I said the same thing. Welcome home, soldier. You're safe here. I spent my days at the project, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as part of the team. I listened to their stories. I shared parts of my own. I found my purpose again, not just as a commander, but as a protector, a guide. In the large yard behind the main building, we built a garden. We filled it with dozens of rose bushes, the same fragrant, deep red variety my mother had loved. It became a place of quiet contemplation and healing for the residents. One sunny afternoon, I was working there alongside a young Air Force veteran, our hands deep in the rich soil. She was quiet for a long time, and then she looked up at me, a small, genuine smile on her face. "Captain," she said, "before I got here, I really thought I had lost the war for good. But now I feel like I'm finally planting my life again." Her words struck a chord so deep within me it brought tears to my eyes. She was right. We weren't just planting flowers, we were planting hope. We were tending to the soil of our own broken lives and watching something new and beautiful begin to grow. Together, we were healing. This, I knew with every fiber of my being, was my mother's true legacy. That evening, I sat alone in my small office at the project, the windows open to the sweet, floral scent of the garden. I took out the last remaining piece of my past I had yet to face, the old USB drive from my mother's memory box. With a slightly trembling hand, I plugged it into my laptop. There was only one file on it, an audio recording. I clicked play, and then I heard her voice, as clear and warm as if she were in the room with me. "Anya, my love," she began. "If you are hearing this, it means the worst has happened, and my plan had to be put into motion. But remember what I always told you. You are a soldier. You are stronger than you will ever know. And when you feel lost, remember to look up at the stars. I am always there, watching over you. Complete the mission, my daughter." The tears fell freely then, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of peace. My story had begun in the shadow of a great loss. It had taken me through the darkest corners of fear and despair. But it ended here, in the quiet light of a new beginning. An ending of found things, of finding justice, of finding a new mission, and finally, of finding a profound and lasting peace right under the steady, silent light of the stars. My journey took me through the darkest night, but I found my way by following the stars my mother left for me. If this story meant something to you, please give it a like. In the comments, I would be honored to hear about the starlight in your own life. A person, a memory, or an act of kindness that guided you through the dark. Thank you for listening.